All right, so we've talked about those items on the grid. There's one last one that we want to talk about that's very commonly referred to, and that is Angus beef. Angus beef, and the most common one of that is certified Angus beef. And so it might be important to just point out, how is Angus beef determined in the United States? And there's two ways that at the packing house you can designate an animal as having Angus heritage. Angus heritage, again, many of those cattle come without any previous records. So how are we going to determine whether those animals have had Angus heritage or not? And there are two ways that that's determined. One is through actual breed records that are presented to the packer, or an affidavit that traces back to the American Angus Association saying, yes, those animals are at least 50% Angus. The other way, and probably most common way that animals are determined to be Angus, is phenotypically, the way the animal looks. So genotype would be registration papers, phenotype would be how the animal looks, and if it meets these criteria, 51% solid black-hided, and no predominant Brahman or dairy influence in those cattle, then those animals could be deemed as Angus heritage. And so when that happens, then those cattle now can be qualified for Angus programs. Not necessarily certified Angus beef, because there is a whole host of other criteria that's required for that particular branded beef program. Now specifically, certified Angus beef is a program that was put forth by the American Angus Association. It was done in 1978. And we're going to highlight that one because it was the first and by far is the largest branded beef program that we have in the United States. So the first thing to become certified Angus beef is it has to be determined to have come from Angus heritage. And as we said, that's phenotypically done usually, sometimes breed records, but mostly how the animal looks, 51% black-hided, no predominant dairy or Brahman influence. Then the carcass has to meet a whole other set of criteria. And those include carcass weight of less than 1,050 pounds, ribeye area of between 10 inches and 16 square inches, and a fat thickness at the 12th rib cross-section of less than an inch. There's also a few other criteria, but those are the major ones. And then probably the biggest one that actually eliminates most cattle from being in the certified Angus beef program is the modest amount of marbling or higher. So it requires, instead of a small amount of marbling, which is what's required for choice, for certified Angus beef, it requires a modest amount of marbling or higher to be in that branded beef program. And that's generally what eliminates most black-hided cattle from that program. So as you look at it, certified Angus beef is just one example, but it is a very big example of a branded beef program. The last item that I want to talk about is cattle that come from Japan. There's two types, and we refer to them as Akaushi and Wagyu cattle in the United States. Japanese red, Japanese black, some other terminologies that you might see. Kobe style or American Kobe. Kobe style or American Kobe. Kobe, you cannot call beef in the United States Kobe beef without putting some other qualifier, because Kobe beef only comes from the region of Japan called Kobe. But we can say American Kobe or Kobe style. Generally, those are cattle that are Japanese blacks or Wagyu cattle that have those kind of genetics and are put into that branded beef program. Those are cattle that have very, very high marbling. And so here's an example of the marbling levels that you would see using the Japanese grading system for the Japanese black or the Wagyu and the Akaushi or the red cattle. And you can see much higher than what we traditionally see in the United States. And in fact, our prime would probably be a score of about 5 on their score, where they go much, much higher. And so as you look at it, it's very, very high marbling. And that's why in Japan they like to buy our beef that is also high in marbling. They like to buy our certified Angus beef or our top choice or upper 2/3 choice and prime beef and ship that to Japan. So as you look at it, Japan and actually some other countries in the Pacific Asia nations, they value marbling at a very high level. And these cattle we have brought over into the United States, and we have crossbred them with some of our cattle here, our domestic cattle, and we are now trying to produce those types of cattle on a larger scale here in the United States. So I hope I've been able to give you a good idea of how cattle that come out of a feed yard those market ready or finished steers and heifers, how their value is determined on those animals, and all the factors that go in place into that. Predominantly quality grade and yield grade, and then also they might look at some other potential defects to come up with a final value on those carcasses.